Now, after The Last Jedi, one of the biggest questions I found myself left with was, what about the Force Ghosts? What had they been up to for the past 30 years since we saw them at the end of Return of the Jedi? Was shortly after the Battle of Endor the last time Luke had seen any of them, outside of Yoda showing up in Episode 8, of course? Or had he been visited frequently by them over the years? Had they even been helping him, guiding him as he rebuilt the Jedi Order? And, well, if the answer to that question is yes, if they were around and Luke's training essentially continued after Return of the Jedi, how did everything go so wrong? How did Luke eventually come to this belief that the Jedi needed to end if he had Yoda, Obi-Wan, Anakin, and likely Qui-Gon too, teaching him the ways of the Force and the Jedi? Here were four beings so wise and powerful with the Force that they could retain their consciousness after death, and they were potentially coming back to teach Luke, and he still failed and came to the belief that the Jedi should end. And personally here, I thought it'd make far more sense for the story they were telling if Luke hadn't seen any of the Force ghosts since Endor, that after the Sith were no more, and the Force was brought into balance, something else, something far more ancient and powerful awoke in the absence of the Sith. A type of manifestation of the dark side itself, you could say, one that predates the Jedi and all their accumulated knowledge. And the real purpose of the Chosen One was to somehow stop this dark side being, and to bring a lasting balance to the Force finally. And this great threat would of course be Snoke, who feared a direct confrontation with Luke, who he knew to be the son of the Chosen One, or someone powerful enough to potentially destroy him. So Snoke's plan was to defeat Luke from afar, by somehow blocking the Force Ghost's ability to manifest, so that they couldn't help Luke learn more about the Jedi and the Force, so that he'd have to try and figure everything out on his own. Furthermore, with his strong mental abilities, Snoke would not only try to corrupt Ben Solo's mind, another potential threat to him, but he would also try to corrupt Luke's mind as well, to at least some degree, which eventually led to that night in the hut where Luke almost strikes down his nephew. This was the moment all of Snoke's hard work and manipulation had paid off, and a seed of doubt was planted in Luke's mind about both himself and the Jedi, one that would fully come to fruition later when he found the First Jedi Temple, a place where he thought he'd be able to learn more about Snoke and how to stop him and save Ben, not to mention commune once more with the Force Ghosts. But again, Snoke predates the Jedi, and so Luke learns little to nothing about them at the First Jedi Temple, not to mention the Force Ghosts still don't appear to him, because they still can't manifest thanks to Snoke, and maybe even in some ways thanks to the dark side power under the island, something that may even be connected to Snoke somehow. And so Luke, still being mentally manipulated or influenced by Snoke and the dark side, begins to give up on the Jedi ways slowly but surely, until he becomes, well, what we see in The Last Jedi. And it's only after Snoke is killed that Yoda is finally able to appear to him again. Though, yeah, in the movie that scene happens before Snoke dies. Which, after this pep talk from Yoda, this then wakes up Luke and leads him to make the ultimate sacrifice of projecting himself to save the Resistance and putting all his faith in Rey, like he once put all his faith in his father. At least that's kind of what I was hoping the whole story would look like. Not saying I would suddenly love The Last Jedi if this had turned out to be how it all played out behind the scenes, but at least the movie could have made more sense and given more context to Luke's fall. But alas, a new book coming out called The Secrets of the Jedi has utterly destroyed this possibility, as well as made the failure of the Jedi of the prequel era pretty much complete. Because according to this book, which is told from Luke's perspective, or presented as if Luke himself has wrote it, we learn that the Force Ghosts, or Force Spirits as Luke calls them in the book, guided him for many years before vanishing after he cut himself off from the Force. Which means, in theory, they were basically there the whole time, teaching Luke all they knew, all they'd learned both in life and after death about the Force, and what the Jedi should be. But Luke apparently didn't learn anything from them, and eventually came to the conclusion that the Jedi should end. Not to mention, the Force Ghosts also apparently didn't give him a heads up about how badly things might go training Ben Solo. And so, sadly here, I don't even know who's the biggest failure in all of this anymore. I mean, we have Yoda and Obi-Wan, who were a part of the initial fall of the Jedi Order during the prequels, and they tried to stop Vader and Sidious, but were ultimately defeated, so they went into exile to retrain themselves in the ways of the Force, so that they could later train Luke and or Leia in the hopes of not only destroying the Sith, but eventually rebuilding the Jedi Order. These two then, Obi-Wan and Yoda, also learned how to preserve their consciousness after death from Qui-Gon Jinn, so that they could come back to help Luke after the fact. And in Season 6 of the Clone Wars, it's heavily implied that it's very important Yoda learn this ability, that the Jedi are going to be defeated, but someone needs to be there after the fact so that they can endure, presumably to help Luke learn and rebuild the Jedi Order one day. Next, we then have Anakin, who I guess, as a Force ghost, never had a heart-to-heart talk with his son, telling him all about how and why he fell to the dark side, how dangerous and manipulative Palpatine was, and how he played the Jedi of the time who hadn't had to worry about the Sith for over 1,000 years, and in that time had also grown very complacent and too close to the Republic, despite the fact that in this book, again written from Luke's perspective, he actually talks about how one of the failings of the Jedi was working too closely with the Republic, meaning he did know. One of the Force ghosts, probably his father or Obi-Wan or Yoda, clearly told him what had happened. Also in this book, Luke says of Qui-Gon Jinn that, unlike the other Jedi of the time, Qui-Gon was more concerned about listening to the will of the Force, not strictly adhering to the Jedi Code, which often put him at odds with the Council. And then, surprise, surprise, it's Qui-Gon of all Jedis that went on to become the first Jedi Force Ghost, which should really say something to Luke, like that maybe Qui-Gon knows what he's talking about. So if Qui-Gon was coming back to chat with Luke, which he likely was, Luke really should have been listening to what that guy had to say. So basically here, in Luke's own words, mind you, he's telling us he knows where things went wrong with the Jedi of the prequel era, that the Force Ghosts have been coming back and no doubt telling him what happened, that they had become arrogant and were turned into tools of the Republic instead of just servants of the Force, that adhering too closely to the Jedi Code and not trusting their instincts had led to their demise. Yet despite knowing all of this, in The Last Jedi, Luke declares failure as the lasting legacy of the Jedi, somehow completely ignoring the fact that for thousands upon thousands of years, 1,000 generations in fact, as Obi-Wan once told him in A New Hope, and as Luke himself echoes in the teaser trailer for The Rise of Skywalker, the Jedi had been keeping peace in the galaxy. And I've used this analogy before, but that'd be like having a car that lasts you literally decades and makes it, a crazy number like 500,000 miles or something like that. And then when it finally does break down, you declare it's been a piece of junk the whole time, and that you'd never ever even consider buying the same type of car again, because in the end it failed. Even though over the years and miles it generally ran great and always got you from point A to point B, though sure, maybe it did have some issues here and there like a flat tire or minor repairs or maintenance that needed to be done, of course. Just like I'm sure the Jedi faced some tough tests and times, and had issues over those thousands upon thousands of years. That it wasn't just always peace and prosperity, free of any conflicts or wars, but that the Jedi always prevailed in the end. Anyway, my point here is that Luke concluding that the Jedi were ultimately a failure and needed to end makes no sense, especially now that we know he learned likely everything he ever wanted to know and more about the Jedi and how they had gone wrong during the prequel era. And sure, I understand Luke may have just been saying all of that in The Last Jedi, about their legacy being a failure and that they need to end, as a means by which to excuse his own failures, that it's not his fault that the Jedi way itself is or was fundamentally flawed, again despite that 1,000 generations where it worked relatively fine as far as we know, and as Luke himself seems to confess in the book. And yeah, I also know that this is just a book meant to sell some copies and make some money for Disney, Lucasfilm, and whoever is publishing this thing. That maybe not a whole lot of thought was put into it, but there really should have been, because this is canon. And whether or not the Force Ghosts were showing up to Luke over the years was a huge question, as I tried to point out at the start of the video. Because if the answer was no, they weren't, a lot could still be done with this story. But now that we know they were, a lot of those doors are closed, and it's harder to explain how and why it all went so wrong for Luke. Take this passage from the book, for example. Again, these are Luke's own words. I had failed to restore the Jedi Order, failed to protect my own students, failed to save my own flesh and blood from our family's dark legacy. It was clear I was not fit to be a Jedi Master, but I had finally realized a difficult truth. No one was. So as chaos continued to rise around me, I chose to end the Jedi Order once and for all. Okay, so let me get this straight here. Chaos was rising all around you, Luke, and you thought that was a good time to end the Jedi. So what exactly was going to bring an end to the chaos then? Was it all just going to eventually work itself out somehow? Was that the game plan? Is the idea here that Luke believes that it's the existence of the Jedi, or those who use the light side, that leads to the coming or rise of dark side users? That Luke thought if he shut himself off from the Force and there's no more light side users, the dark side users would cease to exist or stop rising? Because that's not how balance works in Star Wars. And one of the main problems with all of this is that Luke's nephew, with that mighty Skywalker blood in his veins, had just run off to join Snoke when Luke came to this decision to end the Jedi. And Snoke is of course a super powerful dark side user who had a military regime called the First Order at his command, a regime that the New Republic wasn't, for some reason, openly opposing and was just letting grow more powerful while they reduced the size of their own military. And something tells me even if Snoke and Kylo had just lost their powers magically, which they clearly didn't when Luke was cut off from the Force, Snoke wouldn't have just disbanded the First Order and given up. Something or someone would have still been needed to do something about them. And so clearly, in a galaxy far, far away, they don't have the saying, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing, because it's asinine to believe that if the Jedi ceased to be, no one evil would ever come about again. It's like trying to argue that if we got rid of the police in the world, that the crime rate would suddenly go down and eventually stop altogether, when I think we all know it'd rise and grow exponentially out of control. And then there's his line about no one is fit to be a Jedi Master. Luke, buddy old pal, you were being visited by 4 Jedi Masters who had become so in tune with the Force, had become such powerful servants of it, that they were literally coming back from the dead to teach you the ways of the Jedi, so that you too and future Jedi could serve the Force as well. I mean, if the Force itself thought them worthy of this great gift, that they should serve it even after death, maybe it's a little ridiculous to say that no one is fit to be a Jedi Master, especially considering you eventually did it too. Anyway, in closing here, and I hate to even say this because I do love the prequels, but I think they did a great disservice to the Jedi. Not that they were meant to or intended to, because as I've argued so many times before, the prequels are meant to show us how far the Jedi had fallen, why they ultimately failed after 1,000 generations. They had become too closely associated with the Republic and followed the code to the letter instead of just listening to the Force. What the prequels were not meant to do was to show us that the Jedi way had been wrong or flawed the whole time, yet many people now cling to this belief after seeing them. And in my opinion, The Return of the Jedi is a much more powerful title for Episode 6 after seeing the prequels, because Luke was meant to represent the return of the real Jedi, or the true Jedi, the way they were meant to be. And yet 2 movies later we have The Last Jedi, because even those writing these movies today don't seem to understand what the prequels were trying to tell us about Star Wars. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about this new information, that Luke was in contact with the Force Ghost the whole time, yet he still lost his way. Whatever it is, let me know in the comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.